The helicopter was rocking in a crosswind, and Gromov, sitting at the window, silently watched the vast expanses of the Kazakh steppe. The ground below was scorched, pocked with craters, and in some places the skeletons of long-abandoned buildings were visible, traces of past trials. But here, in this damned place, something was happening that forced the KGB to send him, an operative of the Second Department, to investigate. The pilot glanced back briefly.
"We're landing in 3 minutes!"
Gromov nodded, adjusting his holster belt. He wasn't a scientist, but he didn't need to understand formulas to know that something really dangerous had happened in this place. His task is to find out if there is a threat to state security. Nothing else mattered. When the helicopter touched down, everything went dark for a moment from the dust raised in front of my eyes. Gromov jumped down, slightly kneeling down, and straightened up, looked around. The wind here was dry, as if it was blowing the last remnants of life out of this land. 2 soldiers in gray greatcoats were waiting for him nearby. One of them stepped forward.
"Lieutenant Gromov?"
"That's right."
"Colonel Kuznetsov is waiting for you in the bunker. Follow me."
Gromov nodded silently. He was not a talker. He was more interested in what was hidden behind all this secrecy. The bunker was located 1 kilometer from the takeoff site. As they walked, Gromov managed to make out several hangars. Trucks and boxes with military department markings were rusting against their walls. There was a faint hum in one of the hangars, as if a powerful machine was working. He remembered that sound. It was stuffy inside the bunker. The air was stagnant, and it smelled of dust, metal, and something chemical. Electric light illuminated narrow corridors littered with folders, devices, and some kind of diagrams. Something big was clearly happening here. "Lieutenant." Colonel Kuznetsov was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s. The tunic fit him perfectly, no creases, no stains. Attentive gray eyes immediately assessed the interlocutor. "I'm glad to see you. You arrived on time." Gromov did not waste time on formalities.
"What's going on here?"
Kuznetsov looked at him for a long moment, then nodded to one of the officers at the door. "Show him the object." Gromov followed them until they found themselves in front of a massive door with a combination lock. The officer entered the code, the lock clicked, and the door slid open with a heavy creak. He saw the room. There was something hanging in the middle of it. Alive. Sphere. The diameter is about 5 meters. She was floating in the air, barely pulsating. Its surface shimmered with silvery light, like mercury, only not spreading, but held in one shape. "Ah!" Gromov did not immediately realize that he was looking at her, because his gaze seemed to slip by, as if his brain refused to realize what he was seeing. "What the hell is this?" "That's exactly what we need to find out," Kuznetsov replied dully. A scientist in a white coat, young and nervous, came closer, holding a tablet with notes in his hands. "It appeared 2 weeks ago. First, energy surges were recorded, then the strange behavior of objects. The metal in this room began to float by itself. The radio was running without power. The instruments recorded something. And then... Then? One of our scientists went inside." There was silence in the hall. Gromov exhaled slowly. "What about him?"
"He's gone."
Kuznetsov nodded silently, confirming the scientist's words. "Show the recording." They went to the monitor. The old tape was turned on. The laboratory is on the screen. A man in a protective suit slowly approaches the sphere. She shimmers like she's alive. The scientist cautiously stretches out his hand. And suddenly, the fingers disappear. The body begins to retract, as if an invisible funnel is pulling it in. The man does not scream. He does not even have time to understand what is happening. A flash, and he's gone.
"It happened 3 days ago," the scientist said quietly.
Gromov stared at the blank screen. "And now what?"
"We continue to experiment."
Gromov looked at Kuznetsov.
"Are you continuing? What if it's something alive?"
The colonel pursed his lips. "That's exactly what we're afraid to find out." At that moment, The light in the room blinked. The lights flashed, then flickered again. Gromov automatically put his hand on his holster. The sphere trembled, and a voice came over the speakers, deaf, distorted.
Can you hear me?
The voice of the missing scientist. Gromov felt his back go cold. Gromov stood motionless, not taking his eyes off the speaker. It was quiet in the laboratory, except for a faulty oscilloscope somewhere in the far corner displaying chaotic lines on the screen.
Can you hear me?
The voice was muffled, as if it were coming from underwater. The scientist Lebedev was frantically flipping through some papers. His face turned pale.
That's
impossible, he managed. Kuznetsov did not move, only clenched his teeth. Are you sure it's him?
We don't have recordings of his voice for comparison, but the timbre matches, Lebedev muttered.
Gromov stepped forward, carefully examining the bubble. It seemed deeper now. There was no longer just a silvery mist swirling in it. There was something like movement in the depths. Shadows. Or shapes? The voice on the speakers wavered again.
Who is there?
Identify yourself, Gromov said firmly, without taking his eyes off the sphere. Pause. It's a long one. Then, Dr. Sorokin. A chill ran down Gromov's spine. That was the name, the missing scientist.
Where are you?
He asked.
I'm here. But
the voice suddenly distorted, as if the radio had picked up static.
Not alone!
A wave of tension ran through the laboratory. Kuznetsov glared at Lebedev.
Is there jamming?
No interference. The signal goes directly, the scientist whispered, quickly switching frequencies.
Who's with you?
Gromov asked again. Loud silence. And then laughter. Low, scratchy, inhuman. Gromov abruptly pulled out his pistol, as if the weapon could somehow influence what was happening. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had begun. They want to get out. After these words, the connection was cut off.
The laboratory was plunged into a ringing silence.
Lebedev clenched his fists so that his knuckles turned white.
We need to turn it all off. No,
Kuznetsov said sharply.
We have to figure out what's going on.
They want to get out, Gromov repeated softly. He was looking at the sphere. She was no longer pulsing steadily as before. Now its surface was trembling, as if something inside was trying to pierce its shell. Lebedev turned even paler. You understand that if he spent 3 days there, but his voice didn't change, it means... Gromov slowly turned to him. It means that time flows differently there. Or that it wasn't him at all, Lebedev added quietly. The sphere shuddered, and suddenly, as if someone invisible had broken through the boundary of reality, the laboratory suddenly became cold. It wasn't just cool. The cold penetrated into the bones, bit into the skin. The light bulbs on the walls flickered. The monitors began to produce meaningless symbols. What the hell? Kuznetsov took a step back. Gromov tightened his grip on the pistol. Lebedev darted to the console with a wild look. We have to... And then the sphere opened. The silence snapped, as if someone had torn the world apart. The silver shell was pulled inside itself in an instant, and then unfolded into something more than just a room. The walls were gone. The lab was gone. Gromov saw only emptiness. Black, bottomless, stretching into infinity. And from that void they were looking at him. Hundreds of eyes. Thousands. They were everywhere. They were not eyes, but something like them. Shapeless, irregular, they moved in a chaotic manner, approached, blinked, disappeared, appeared again. And then something came out of that darkness. Figure, high, human, but too elongated, as if her body had been stretched in different directions. Gromov couldn't see the face, just the shadow. But he knew what it was doing. It was smiling. Kuznetsov screamed. Lebedev rushed to the switch. The light flickered one last time. And it all ended. Gromov did not see, did not hear, did not feel anything. In an instant, reality collapsed, and he seemed to fall into the void. There was a ringing in my ears, as if after an explosion. And then, a sound. A dull, low rumble, like the distant hum of a siren. He opened his eyes. The lab is back. But something was wrong. The light bulbs on the ceiling barely glowed, flickering with a dim reddish light. The air was thick, heavy, and tinged with rust. The equipment around him was sparking, and the screens showed nothing but static. Kuznetsov was lying against the wall, unconscious. Lebedev sat on the floor, breathing heavily, his hands shaking. But the sphere was no more. Gromov tried to stand up. My legs felt weak and my head was spinning. "Lebedev," he managed hoarsely. The scientist slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide and his face was covered in sweat. "We—" He swallowed, ran a trembling hand over his face. "Are we still here?" Gromov clenched his fingers. They were touching the floor. He could feel it. "Yes. But—" Something was wrong. There was silence in the room. Full. Gromov couldn't even hear himself breathing. He got up slowly, walked over to Kuznetsov, bent down, checked his pulse. "We need to get out of here." Lebedev did not move. He was just looking. Somewhere. Gromov followed his gaze. At the far end of the room, in a corner where almost no light fell, there was something. Shadow. She was unnatural, as if she didn't belong there. Black, elongated, faintly wavering, like smoke on a windless day. And she was looking at them. Gromov grabbed Lebedev by the shoulder. "Get up!" Lebedev did not move. He seemed to freeze, his mouth hanging open, his fingers clutching his knees. The shadow took a step. And then she disappeared. I just became part of the darkness. Gromov pulled out a pistol and fired into a corner. The clap reverberated through the room. The shell casing clattered to the floor. Nothing. Kuznetsov groaned, slowly coming to his senses. "We need to leave now," Gromov said through his teeth. Lebedev was still staring into space, but then he nodded slowly. They lifted Kuznetsov up and dragged him to the exit. Gromov reached for the door handle and froze. The door was wrong. Previously, it was massive, metal, with a combination lock. Now there was an ordinary wooden door in front of them, with peeling paint, and thin black smoke was streaming out from under it. Lebedev trembled.
"This is not our door!"
Gromov slowly released the handle. There was a faint rustle behind him. He turned around, and I saw a face appear on the screen of an old monitor. It was blurry, indistinct, but it was moving. It was smiling. And then it spoke in Sorokin's voice.
"You opened it!"
The screen blinked, went out. Gromov clenched his teeth.
"We're leaving!"
He pushed the door open, and he stepped into the darkness. Darkness was replaced by light. Sharp, blinding, icy. Gromov squeezed his eyes shut, took a step forward, and pulled Lebedev and Kuznetsov after him. They went out. But where? It was not a bunker corridor. It didn't look like a real place at all. At first, it seemed that there was emptiness around them, but gradually outlines began to appear in it. Walls, floors, some kind of structures. It just looked wrong. The walls were too smooth, as if they were moving, breathing. The ceiling stretched upward, but there was no end in sight. The air was viscous and had to be inhaled with effort. Gromov took another step, clutching the pistol in his hand. Lebedev was breathing heavily next to him, and he kept looking around. Kuznetsov was pale, but he held on. No one said a word. They didn't know where they were. A sound was heard in the distance. The rattle. It was like claws scratching metal, slow, rhythmic. Gromov froze. "It's not a bunker," Lebedev finally managed.
Obviously,
Kuznetsov said dryly, looking around. Gromov listened intently. Somewhere in this strange, shaky reality, something was moving. "We have to go," he said. But as soon as they took a couple of steps, the space changed again. The floor shook under my feet, and the walls began to shift as if they were alive. They distorted, changed shape, stretched, as if space itself was trying to hold them. And then there was a sound. Whisper. More than one voice. There were dozens of them. Hundreds. They filled the air, sounded from everywhere. Unfamiliar, but at the same time strangely familiar. Gromov heard his name.
Alexei!
He whirled around. There was a man standing behind her, or something that looked almost like a human. Face. It's too correct. Smooth, almost waxy skin. Eyes. Empty. Black. Bottomless. He was wearing a KGB uniform, but it sat on him somehow unnaturally, as if the fabric obeyed other laws of physics. Gromov raised his pistol.
Stop!
The figure smiled.
You opened the door!
It was his voice. Gromov's voice. He felt something constrict inside him. Lebedev took a step back. "Oh my God!" The figure began to change. His face trembled, blurred like the film in an old movie projector, and for a moment it became his own face. Gromov fired. The bullet hit the target. The figure jerked, but did not fall. She continued to smile. And then she took a step towards him. And the world collapsed again. Gromov did not feel the impact, but suddenly realized that he was no longer standing on his feet. The floor was gone. His body was flying in the void, surrounded by blurry shadows. He seemed to be falling into infinity, but he didn't feel sick or dizzy. It wasn't a fall. It was something else. He tried to breathe, but the air became thick, sticky, like thick smoke. Then everything stopped. He was in the room. The same laboratory. But something has changed here. She looked exactly the same as before, but there was an unnatural tension in the air. Everything was a little bit wrong. The walls seemed too flat. The ceiling went higher than it should have. The shadows from objects did not fall where they should. Lebedev and Kuznetsov stood side by side, looking around in a daze.
What is this?
Lebedev managed hoarsely. Gromov raised his hand with a pistol, but suddenly realized that his weapon was no longer there. It just disappeared. "Are we back?" Kuznetsov looked confused, but his hand was still reaching for his holster. "No," Gromov whispered. And then they heard footsteps. Thudding, slow, as if someone heavy was moving on the floor. A figure appeared from the far corner of the laboratory. This time it's not blurry, not wavering, but perfectly clear. Human. He was tall and wore a battered lab coat. He moved unsteadily, swaying. "Face!" Gromov clenched his teeth. It was Sorokin, the scientist who disappeared. He looked the same as in the old photographs. He hadn't changed at all. He hadn't aged. But there was something wrong with his expression. "Dr. Sorokin?" Kuznetsov took a step forward, but Gromov abruptly grabbed his arm. "Don't move," he said. Lebedev has already figured it out. Sorokin was smiling, but his eyes, they were empty, black. "Can you hear us?" Lebedev spoke cautiously, as if afraid of scaring him off. Sorokin did not respond immediately. "Then?" He repeated the question, word for word, in the same voice, in the same tone. "Can you hear us?" Kuznetsov cursed, retreating. Gromov instinctively stepped back. Sorokin didn't move, but his smile widened, unnaturally wider, as if the facial muscles weren't working the way they should. "Where have you been?" Lebedev asked again, but his voice was trembling. And again, with the same intonation, Sorokin repeated the question. "Where have you been?" Lebedev now took a step back. "My God, it's not him." Sorokin laughed. His laughter was hoarse, cracked, as if he wasn't laughing, but simply reproducing the sound of laughter. Then he jerked forward.
Gromov jerked back. Kuznetsov jumped back. Lebedev screamed.
Sorokin moved towards them too quickly, unnaturally, as if his feet weren't touching the floor. And at that moment, the ceiling began to collapse. The lamps exploded, the walls shook, and silver light gushed out of the void again. Shadows swirled around them, and Gromov realized what they had done. They let him out. Gromov did not have time to understand anything as the laboratory changed again. Everything became blurry, as if reality could no longer hold its shape. The floor swayed, the walls stretched and disappeared, and the air was filled with a low rumble that made my ears ring. Lebedev was shouting, but his voice sounded muffled, as if through water. Kuznetsov fired, the sound muffled and muffled, as if the bullet had pierced not air, but something viscous. Sorokin was no longer human. His face fell. His eyes became too big, too dark. His mouth widened into an inhuman smile that filled Politz. He stood in front of them, swaying slightly, and watched. "They're watching," he said in a strange voice. And then it started coming out. The shadows around him stirred. They were no longer just shadows, but shapes formed from them. Tall, thin, with long limbs, with holes instead of eyes. They moved slowly, as if listening. Their bodies were trembling, as if they had not yet fully frozen in this reality. "Get back! Back!" Gromov grabbed Lebedev and Kuznetsov, dragging them away, but there was nowhere to go. The laboratory no longer existed. They stood in the void. Silvery light slowly flowed through the space, forming walls and strange structures that looked like intertwined bones. And then Sorokin raised his hand. She wasn't his. It was too long, too thin, and the skin on it moved as if something alive was crawling under it. "You opened the door. Now they're here." His voice was changing. Dozens of voices sounded in it, overlapping each other, merging into a single whisper. Lebedev was gasping for breath, tears streaming down his face.
Kuznetsov clenched his fists, but Gromov saw that he was afraid.
Gromov wasn't thinking.
He sprinted forward. If it was an illusion, he had to break through it.
If it was a nightmare, he had to wake up.
If they were still in their world, there had to be a way out.
But as soon as he touched Sorokin, everything disappeared.
Tsum.
He woke up, lying on the cold laboratory floor. The lights were on, the appliances were working, and old Soviet posters hung on the walls. Lebedev was crying, sitting against the wall, covering his face with his hands. Kuznetsov did not move. And Sorokin disappeared. Gromov slowly got up, checking his body with trembling hands. He was here. They're back. But something has changed. Kuznetsov suddenly inhaled sharply and whispered, "They're still here." And at that moment, the lights blinked again.